There are interviews, and then there are interventions. From the moment Letitia James stepped onto the set of the Steve Harvey Show, it was clear this wasn't going to be another cheerful round of network banter and viral anecdotes. The lighting hadn't changed, but somehow it felt dimmer, like the studio itself knew something heavier was about to unfold. Steve Harvey stood with his usual warmth, cue cards in hand, but even he seemed to sense it. The energy was off-script, unrehearsed. This wasn't stage banter. This was something sacred masquerading as a late-night conversation. The audience didn't cheer wildly. They leaned forward. They didn't know why yet, but they felt it. And Steve, always the perceptive one, adjusted without needing a signal. "Tonight," he said, smiling with a restraint that came not from discomfort, but from reverence. "We're not talking headlines. We're talking what the headlines never print." He introduced her not as the Attorney General of New York, not as the political icon who had stood firm in the face of endless investigations and bottomless media vitriol, but as someone who, in his words, knows the weight of power and the price of principle. No grand entrance, no political flourish. Letitia walked in with the quiet strength of a woman who'd been burned in the fire and decided to light her own path with the embers. Dressed in navy with no frills, no slogans, she took her seat beside Steve like someone stepping into a courtroom rather than a studio. Her body language was calm, but her eyes, sharp, searching, spoke of sleepless nights and truths too costly to speak casually. The crowd clapped politely, unsure if this was an interview or a reckoning. Steve offered her a warm nod. "We usually keep it light around here, but I get the feeling you didn't come here for light." Letitia gave a faint smile, but it was the kind that came from remembering something unshareable. "No, Steve," she said plainly. "I came because some stories aren't meant to be told when the room is laughing." A beat passed. It landed harder than most monologues. She turned to face him fully. "You said once that God doesn't waste pain," she began. "And you said it with a crucifix on your chest, like it was the only thing holding you up that day. I remember that video. I wasn't in the room, but it still found me. And tonight, I need to give that moment back to you." Steve blinked, surprised not just by the intensity, but by the precision. The audience stilled again. It wasn't about policy anymore. This wasn't politics. This was testimony. Letitia continued, her tone more reflective now. "I've walked through media firestorms, courtrooms where people looked at me like I didn't belong, and meetings where they shook my hand with one and sharpened knives with the other. And the truth is, it's easy to become numb, to forget you're a person. But that one clip, the one where you talked about storms, about survival, about faith, that clip reminded me I wasn't alone. It reminded me that dignity doesn't require a spotlight, and truth doesn't always come with applause." Steve's eyes dropped toward the crucifix, almost unconsciously. He didn't speak, just listened. That alone told the crowd this wasn't a setup. It was surrender. Letitia's voice softened, not out of weakness, but clarity. "You weren't preaching that day. You weren't trying to teach anything. You were just bleeding out loud. And it turns out, sometimes that's the most faithful thing a person can do." Steve tilted his head. "You talk about silence like it's familiar," he said, his voice more breath than sound. "It is." Letitia nodded. "It's been my companion longer than most people have been my allies. But in that silence, sometimes I hear the only thing worth listening to." He leaned back slightly, studying her expression, now clearly moved. "You ever hear God in that silence?" For the first time in the interview, Letitia paused. Not the kind of pause people use for drama. This was different. This was someone choosing words like they were evidence on record. The answer was coming. And it wasn't for ratings. It was for salvation. Steve had asked the question like a man who knew the weight of it, softly, but not idly. "You ever hear God in that silence?" Letitia didn't flinch. Her gaze stayed fixed on him, not cold, not defensive, just tired in a way that only people who have stood too long at podiums under too many lights pretending not to bleed can be. "Yes," she said, and for the first time since she entered, her voice lost its polish. "I've questioned it. I've walked away from it. I've felt so alone in rooms packed with cameras and clapping hands, you would have thought I was in exile." She paused, then added, "But even in the darkest hours, especially in the hours when I knew my face was trending, but my soul was sinking, there was still something. A presence. A quiet that didn't mock me. It didn't fix anything, but it didn't lie to me either." Steve's fingers curled around the crucifix, that familiar anchor now glowing beneath stage lights that suddenly seemed too artificial for what was unfolding. "That's faith," he murmured, "even when it doesn't have a name, even when it's just something you feel." Letitia's eyes dropped to the cross, not with awe, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had once stared at a symbol like that and wondered if it was just jewelry or if it might still be an invitation. "Steve," she said, her tone lowering into something more intimate, more defiant. "Can I tell you something I've never said out loud before?" He nodded. No applause, no cue cards. Just a host unarmed and a guest unmasked. Letitia inhaled deliberately. "There was a night not long ago," she began, "where I sat in my apartment, scrolling, not searching, not hoping, just surviving. I hadn't eaten, I hadn't slept. I was tired of being strong for people who only liked me when I was smiling through their nonsense." Her words didn't crack, they cut. "And in that fog, I came across a video. It was you, not in a suit, not behind a desk, just you and a mic talking about purpose, about how God doesn't waste pain. And, Steve, I didn't hear a sermon. I heard a man who'd crawled through fire and still had the nerve to call it faith." Steve's shoulders dropped slightly. Letitia's next line didn't ask for permission. It was testimony. "And you were wearing that cross," she said, pointing gently. "The same one. You clutched it like you were daring the world to mock it. I watched that clip 3 times. She sat back, breath steady. Not for effect, but because the truth always makes the lungs work harder. "And the next morning, for the first time in weeks, I stood up. I brushed my hair. I remembered I wasn't just someone's headline." Steve's mouth parted, but nothing came out. There were no jokes now, no neat transitions, just the sound of one woman turning public vulnerability into private revolution. "You weren't trying to inspire," Letitia said, voice now laced with irony. "Which is exactly why you did. You didn't quote scripture. You didn't preach. You just told the truth. And in this industry, Steve, the truth is rarer than a politician admitting they were wrong." The crowd didn't laugh, but a few smirked like they'd been hit right between the ribs. Letitia's gaze softened. "That crucifix you wear, it's not just jewelry. It's not a brand. It's a broadcast. And whether you like it or not, Steve Harvey, you've been preaching with it for years." Steve looked down, almost afraid to meet her eyes again. "You think you're just a comedian with faith," she added. "But some of us think you're something else entirely." The silence that followed didn't belong to television. It didn't belong to politics or religion or branding. It belonged to something bigger. And that's when she said it. Slow, deliberate, no smile. "You're a minister in disguise." She didn't say it to flatter him. She said it to remind him. And just like that, the tone of the show shifted again. Not to sadness, not to triumph, but to reckoning. Because if a woman like Letitia James, bruised by press cycles and battered by public life, could still recognize grace in someone else, then maybe, just maybe, the next part of this story wasn't going to be about surviving at all. It was going to be about remembering what survival had turned her into. Letitia paused, just long enough for the silence to remind people they weren't watching another promo interview. Then she spoke again, this time softer. Too soft for politics, just right for truth. "I kept working," she said. "Because when you're a woman in power," scratch that, "when you're a black woman in power, you're not allowed to fall apart in public. You get one emotion, poised. Anything else, and they call you angry, unhinged, or my personal favorite, difficult to manage." Her mouth curled slightly. Imagine that. A grown woman elected to enforce the law, expected to be manageable. A few people in the audience exhaled, quietly stunned. Steve didn't interrupt. He could feel it coming. "I did the interviews," she continued, kept giving answers to questions no one asked, played the part, smiled on cue because disappearing behind the title is easier than explaining to America that you're drowning under their expectations and their hashtags. And the more you disappear, the more they applaud your grace under pressure, not realizing that grace sometimes just means knowing when to shut up and not cry where they can screenshot it. She leaned back slightly, letting the truth air itself out. But eventually, even the noise outside couldn't drown out the silence inside, and one night it almost won. Steve tilted his head, visibly unsettled, but present. "It was late," Letitia said. "I hadn't eaten in days, hadn't slept in longer. Couldn't pray, couldn't talk, couldn't even lie to myself anymore with those 'I'm okay' texts." She paused. "So I sat, in the dark, no statements, no spin, just me, and the silence." Her voice dipped even lower. The kind of silence that doesn't echo, just stares back at you, asking if you're really as strong as the profile photo says. And then she shifted. "I picked up my phone, not for help. I was just trying not to feel like furniture in my own home. I scrolled. Nothing fancy. Just the algorithm doing its nosy little dance. And there you were." Steve blinked, caught off guard. "You were on stage, talking about storms, talking about how God doesn't waste pain. And Steve, you weren't polished. You weren't performing. You were raw, like a man who had swallowed his own grief and still had enough courage to spit up hope for someone else." Steve nodded slowly. He remembered that moment. The one taped after a show nobody watched, on a night he almost didn't show up. "I don't know why I stopped scrolling," Letitia admitted. "But I watched the whole thing. Then I watched it again, and I'm telling you, when you said, 'If you're still breathing, it means God's not finished with you yet,' I felt seen. Not as A.G. James, not as some headline fighting City Hall, just as me, a black woman in the dark who needed to believe there was still something left worth showing up for." Steve's hand now rested fully on the crucifix. His mouth opened slightly, but he let her continue. "And I need you to hear this, Steve," she said. "That night, I stood up. Not because I was healed, not because I had answers, but because for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel invisible." The audience didn't cough, didn't fidget. They were suspended. Steve blinked, eyes wet. "I never planned to tell this story," Letitia added. "But when I saw you sitting here, I knew I had to, because the world knows you as the man who makes people laugh, lifts spirits, keeps the cameras rolling. But I know you as the man who stopped me from disappearing." Steve's voice came slow, thick. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Letitia replied. "You already did, years ago, on a stage with bad lighting, no teleprompter, and a heart that hadn't given up." She gestured toward his chest. "And that crucifix you wear? That was the first thing I saw. Before the words, before the message. It was a lighthouse, and I was drowning." Steve looked down, instinctively tightening his grip on it. "I kept watching your message, not because it fixed me," Letitia said, "but because it reminded me healing doesn't need press coverage. Just hope." She paused, eyes scanning the room like she was talking to every viewer watching in silence. "You think you're just talking, just entertaining, just surviving. But that night, you were rescuing somebody too stubborn to call it a rescue." Steve closed his eyes, lips trembling. Letitia didn't stop. "The world sees you as a host, a comic, a safe laugh in unsafe times. But that's not the full truth. You're not just telling jokes. You're carrying people. And that's not comedy. That's calling." She let the weight land. "You ever wonder why people are drawn to you?" "All the time," Steve admitted quietly. "It's not your voice they hear, Steve," she said. "It's your spirit they feel." He chuckled, short, broken, disarmed. "I'm just trying to make it like everybody else." "And that," Letitia said, "is why it matters. You're not trying to be anything other than yourself, and because of that, you reach people who forgot how to listen." She turned slightly to the audience, voice now unshaken. "People in rooms like this, people on the other side of a screen, people sitting in the dark thinking they don't matter." Then she turned back. Her voice didn't rise, it deepened. "And tonight, Steve, I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to remind you. You didn't save a politician. You saved a person." And with that, the air shifted again. Just slightly. Enough to signal. The reckoning had only begun. "And I know it's hard sometimes," Letitia said, her voice slowing to meet the weight in the room. "Carrying that kind of responsibility, wondering if what you're doing even matters when the spotlight feels more like a surveillance drone than a stage light." Steve nodded slightly. No words, just the kind of acknowledgement that only comes from living what she had just said. "But I'm here to tell you," Letitia continued, her voice cutting through the stillness like gospel in denim. "It does." And just when the moment seemed to crest emotionally, she shifted. Not soft, not sentimental, more intentional. Her posture straightened, her tone lowered, and her words came like a verdict. "Steve, the way you carry that crucifix, it's not just some sacred accessory to match your moral monologues. It's a signal, a message. And tonight, I've brought something back to you, something that might change your life, because once upon a time, it changed mine." Steve looked up, startled not by volume, but by truth. The crowd instinctively leaned forward, as if gravity had suddenly moved toward her. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice thin but open. Letitia didn't blink. "I've held these words for years," she said. "They came from you, and I need to return them, because somewhere along the way, you might have forgotten the power they hold." That sentence didn't hit like a compliment. It hit like accountability. And Steve, visibly stilled by the moment, sat straighter as Letitia inhaled deep. Not for dramatics, but for calibration. "I remember the video," she began. "It wasn't polished. It was grainy, handheld, bad lighting, looked like someone filmed it with a microwave. But you were there, one hand gripping a mic, the other resting right here." She gestured toward his chest. "Over that cross." Steve's throat moved, slow, uneven. "You were talking about purpose," she continued, "but not the clean kind they like on campaign billboards. No, you were fighting through it. You said, pain has a language that when someone who's been through something speaks it, it cuts through the noise." She paused. "And then you said something that has refused to leave me. God doesn't always call the qualified. He qualifies the called." Her eyes didn't leave him. Steve's hand found its way back to the crucifix again, as if the quote itself had pulled his fingers there. "You said God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. That sometimes, even when you think you're just telling jokes or trying to pay a few bills, He's using you to deliver a message someone else has been dying to hear." Steve leaned forward now, elbows on knees, the old video flooding his memory, the one he recorded with no script, no sponsor, no smile. "And I realized something that day," Letitia said, eyes narrowing with conviction. "It wasn't just the words, Steve. It was the way you said them. You meant them. And in a culture where most people say things like they're rehearsing for a job interview, that kind of belief, it ignites things, even in people like me." She looked down briefly, not to gather herself, but to acknowledge the next sentence wasn't theory. It was scar tissue. "I had lost my compass, not just in the headlines or the politics, but in the silence behind all that. I had people in my corner, sure, but none of them knew how to reach the corner I was in." Steve exhaled, slowly, as if those corners were familiar. "You didn't know me," she said, "but somehow you became a beacon." Steve let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, and it landed like confession. Letitia softened, not weakly, but like a judge offering clemency. "And that's the thing about beacons, Steve. They don't always know who's watching. They just keep shining." She paused, not because she was done, but because truth needed room to echo. "You know," Steve said quietly, "sometimes I wonder if I've done enough. If all this comedy, all this hosting, actually means anything." Letitia leaned in, voice unshaken. "It does." He shook his head, eyes low. "I was just trying to survive, man. I wasn't trying to save anybody." "And that," Letitia said, "is exactly why you did." There was no dramatic sting, no crowd gasp, just a shift, the kind that rearranges molecules. People wiped their eyes. Others sat back, overwhelmed by the quiet violence of sincerity. Steve looked at her now. No smile, just depth. "You said something changed in you when you saw that video," he said. "What was it?" Letitia didn't hesitate. "Hope," she said simply. "That maybe the silence wasn't the end of my story. That maybe, just maybe, God wasn't finished with me yet." And just like that, the audience stopped being spectators. They became witnesses. She looked directly at him. "And seeing that crucifix on your chest while you spoke about divine purpose, it wasn't just decor. It wasn't coincidence. It was confirmation. A quiet reminder that light doesn't ask for permission. It finds its way in, even through a cracked screen and a cynical heart." Steve nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting something too old for words. Letitia held the pause. "You reminded me I wasn't forgotten, that my story wasn't over, no matter how many headlines tried to write the last sentence for me." She took a breath. Not for effect, but to prepare the room for what was next. And I remember exactly what you said, Steve. Word for word. I've carried it for years, tucked away like legal precedent in a trial no one sees. And tonight, I need to give it back. Because maybe you've forgotten how powerful it really is. Her voice didn't rise. It deepened. Steve blinked, a question forming in his eyes. Letitia answered it before it left his lips. Sometimes you're not the one being rescued, Steve. Sometimes you're the one doing the rescuing, and you don't even know it. His lips trembled slightly. You think you're just talking, he said quietly. But you're actually testifying. Letitia leaned back a bit, letting the silence expand. You remembered all that? Steve asked, hands now clasped like someone trying to hold their own center. I needed to, she replied, because I wasn't just listening to you. I was being lifted. The room shifted again, no longer just a stage. It felt like a courtroom where the only evidence that mattered was grace. Steve sat still, overwhelmed. Letitia's voice dropped to a whisper. You matter, Steve. Not because of what you do, but because of who you are. You carried faith into places where no one had any left, including me. Steve couldn't speak. His chest rose and fell with the slow, unfiltered rhythm of someone remembering how to breathe. Then, barely audible, Letitia added, And tonight, I have something to tell you that may change your life, just like you changed mine. He looked up, his expression open but undone. The studio froze, not staged, not rehearsed, just human. Letitia leaned forward again, but this time there was something new in her eyes. She wasn't quoting anymore. She was delivering. I remember every word of that message, she said, and I want to speak them back to you, not as a reminder, but as a mirror. Steve's eyes locked on hers. She didn't blink. God doesn't always use the mighty or the perfect. Sometimes he picks the broken, the ones no one bets on, because they know how to reach people the strong can't. Steve blinked, the words washing over him, not like inspiration, but like a tide too long denied. She continued, You don't need a pulpit to preach. You don't need a robe to be called. And you sure don't need a church to carry the word. Her voice didn't tremble. It sharpened. Sometimes your pain is your ministry, and sometimes your comedy is the disguise God uses to smuggle hope into places where religion got banned. Steve's lips parted, but there was nothing left to say. His defenses were gone. Then Letitia looked at him, not as a fan, not as a public official, but as a witness. You thought you were just making people laugh, but you were reaching hearts. You were saving lives. You were carrying light into rooms that had been dark for too long. And then she delivered the line that broke him. You're a minister, Steve. You just wear a suit instead of a collar. His head dropped. One hand covered his face. The other gripped the cross at his chest like it was the only thing holding him up. Tears spilled, unhidden, unedited. The audience didn't applaud. They didn't move. They just witnessed. Then Letitia whispered, as if something sacred was guiding her next words. That crucifix you carry, it's not just a symbol, Steve. It's a signal. And tonight, I believe it's pointing to something bigger than either of us. Steve looked up, eyes wet, jaw clenched. Letitia inhaled deeply, not with performance, but purpose. Because tonight, I have something to tell you, something that may shift everything. His face changed, part fear, part awe, and she leaned in once more, her voice low but unwavering. Like you changed mine. Steve wiped his face slowly, his hand trembling as it dropped. Nothing else needed to be said. Not yet. Because what was about to happen would no longer belong to the stage. It would belong to whatever comes after testimony. The tears hadn't fully stopped, but now they sat differently. No longer signs of release, but of recognition. Something sacred, something settled. Even the studio lights seemed to dim themselves in reverence. Letitia sat quietly across from him, no longer testifying, just waiting. And then, with a breath so soft it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who hadn't lived through silence, she said it. "Steve, there's something I need to tell you. A sentence that's lived inside me for years. I've never said it out loud, until now." He nodded slowly, eyes locked on hers, his voice nearly gone. "Go ahead." She leaned forward, not with performance, but precision. "God uses his chosen ones," she began, "even when they think they're just telling jokes." Steve didn't move, not a blink. "You thought you were just entertaining," she said, "just trying to carry people through the noise. But Steve, you were saving lives." A tear slid down his cheek again, this one quieter but heavier. It wasn't about pain, it was about comprehension. Letitia nodded gently, as if to confirm the unspoken. "This is real." "You saved mine," she added, "and you didn't even know it." For a moment the room forgot it was a show. Even the cameras seemed to slow, bowing to what had taken over. Steve leaned back, a breath escaping from someplace deep. Part laugh, part sob, part disbelief. "I was just trying to make it, man," he whispered. "Trying to get through my pain like everybody else." "Exactly," Letitia said. "That's what made it holy." The words hung like incense in the air, unhurried, irreversible. Then Steve stood up, not as a host, not as a brand, but as a man undone. His body shook, not from weakness, but from release. He said nothing, just reached for the crucifix again and stared at her. Letitia didn't move. She stood too, and now they faced each other. One woman who had walked through fire wearing a badge, and one man who had spoken faith without ever asking to be called a preacher. And then Steve asked the question, not out of doubt, but out of the ache only the chosen ever feel. "Why me?" Letitia didn't answer right away. She let the silence speak for her. Then she stepped forward and said it without ceremony. "I'll tell you." She didn't rush. She let the air carry the weight of the words. "Because God chooses the unlikely," she said softly. "The ones no one bets on. The ones who bled behind the curtain. He chooses the ones who speak with scars, not with scripts, because they know how to speak to pain without making it a performance." Steve didn't move. His eyes were wet with something older than emotion. It was reverence. "You're not the loudest," Letitia continued. "You're not polished. You didn't go to seminary. You didn't memorize verses to earn applause. But God saw your scars and trusted you with a microphone anyway." And then, in the stillness of that thunderless storm, Steve whispered again, "But why me?" His voice cracked, not from fear, but from awe. Why would he pick me? Letitia took one final step forward, now directly in front of him. The cameras didn't zoom. They just held their breath with the rest of the room. "I'll tell you," she said again, her voice calm but absolute. "Because he knew you wouldn't use it to glorify yourself. Because he knew you'd use that mic to hold the light steady for the rest of us." Steve breathed out like it hurt. "I've thought about quitting before," he admitted, stepping away from the spotlight. "From all of it." Letitia nodded, no surprise in her face. "So have I," she said, more than once. And that's when they both sat back down. Not because the weight had passed, but because the foundation had shifted. Steve leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes searching the floor like it might answer him. "I've asked God more than once," he confessed. "What do you want from me? Sometimes I feel like I'm not good enough to speak on faith, not clean enough, not consistent enough." Letitia nodded once more, her voice low but clear. "And that's exactly why he chose you." Steve looked up. "Because your voice doesn't sound like a preacher's," she said. "It sounds like someone who knows what it's like to lose, to fight, to cry in the dark, and still show up anyway. No music, no applause, just presence." Steve turned to her again, eyes sharpened by something deeper than curiosity. "Do you really believe," he asked, "that we can still have faith in a world like this?" The question didn't belong to either of them anymore. It belonged to every soul watching, wondering the same thing. And Letitia James, prosecutor, public servant, public target, was about to answer not as a politician, but as a witness. And the way Letitia looked back at him, calm, resolute, her presence glowing with something that felt carved from beyond herself, made it unmistakably clear. Whatever she was about to say next would not be forgotten. Steve's voice hovered low, almost unsure whether he should say it, but it came anyway. "Do you really believe we can still have faith in a world like this?" Letitia didn't respond right away. She just held his gaze, unblinking, like she was waiting for the words to find her spine before they found her lips. The question lingered in the air like the last echo of a courtroom closing argument. Rhetorical, but real. Then finally, she said it. Quietly, without a quiver. "I believe faith is the only thing left that isn't pretending." Steve tilted his head, his expression unreadable but wide open. And Letitia kept going, her voice low but deliberate. "In politics, we follow scripts. On camera, everything's spun, corrected, filtered. We rehearse grief, we manufacture strength. But faith?" She paused. "Faith has no director, no teleprompter. It demands truth. It demands surrender." She leaned in slightly, not for drama, but because honesty doesn't always carry well in wide shots. Faith isn't glamorous. It doesn't trend. It doesn't come with a verified check. It won't win you votes, and it's definitely not invited to the after party. But it saves people, quietly, deeply, forever. Steve nodded, slow and steady, his heart now visibly catching up to his breath. "Washington teaches you how to survive," Letitia said, "but faith teaches you how to live, how to get up when survival isn't enough anymore." The room didn't stir, but something had shifted, the kind of ripple that doesn't move air but rearranges hearts. "Faith," she added, "is the only path left that doesn't need a spotlight, a camera, or an audience. It's the only place where it's just you and God and the truth between you." Steve couldn't speak. He just placed his hand over his chest, where the crucifix sat, and nodded. "I didn't grow up in the church the way folks like to assume," Letitia admitted, "but I've come to believe that faith is real. Not because someone preached it to me, but because it met me in silence. It found me when the lights were off and no one was around." She turned to Steve again, eyes clear. "It met me through you." Steve trembled, not out of fear but recognition. Letitia didn't blink. Not the broadcast version of you, not the motivational package, the real you, the tired, unvarnished, wounded but still standing you, the man with a cross on his chest who had the courage to speak life into a stranger through a screen. She stood slowly, and after a beat, so did he. They looked at each other, not as guest and host, not as Democrat and comedian, not even as public figures, but as human beings whose pain had been turned into something sacred. Then, Letitia stepped forward and opened her arms. Steve didn't hesitate. He walked in. They embraced, not with ceremony, not with spotlight, but with something so old and so holy it didn't need to be named. The audience stood slowly, almost instinctively. No one clapped. Not yet. It didn't feel right to interrupt what was happening. For a moment, the room was still. And then Steve turned to the crowd, voice cracked, but carrying the full weight of everything just spoken. "I've had a lot of moments on this stage," he said, "but this was the greatest gift I've ever received." He closed his eyes for a beat, then lifted his head, and with all the sincerity he had left, he whispered, "Let's pray." And in that studio, in front of millions of homes, one woman who had carried justice in her name and one man who had carried laughter on his shoulders became, just for a moment, not headlines, not performers, not survivors, but instruments of healing. And for that brief moment, the world didn't scroll. The world believed again.